some of our opponents believe that they have the explanation for everything, the justification for everything, the meaning of everything, now, yesterday, tomorrow, and to the ends of time and eternity.
In a sense, Josh, I think what I'm hearing you do is ask me to steel-man Islamism so that we know where the weaknesses are for Western Enlightenment values, so we know what we have to defend, because we, by me steel-manning Islamism, know what's coming under attack. And that would be, I suppose, the purpose of this exercise. So I will steel-man Islamism with the caveat that everyone understands here that I haven't decided to renege on my...
And just for people who aren't up with the jargon, just remind them what...
Get a video of you.
This is,
just remind people what steel manning means.
Right, so the best way to build, to respond to your adversary's case is to actually respond to what they are saying rather than respond to what you are imputing that they are saying. If you impute that somebody is saying something they are not, it's called a straw man. And of course, you find yourself not responding to their actual point, much to their frustration. And it's much healthier for conversation, but also if you want to change somebody's mind, that you respond to what they are actually saying. And so to build an argument for what somebody's actually saying is called to steel man, and in a sense it's the opposite of a straw man. As I said, that's imputing something to somebody when they're not actually saying that. So I will steel man Islamism for the panel. And I suppose we can go from there, because then we know something. We know, all of us here, obviously, by definition, are concerned about building a case for the defense, but beyond defense, I suppose, the propagation of Western Enlightenment values. I put the word Western in quotation marks for reasons we may want to come to later. But Enlightenment values, essentially. And because they are the best that we've got at the moment. And they're the best of a bad bunch of ideas. I think Brett will come in at some stage to talk about why there's some weaknesses there, but we need to know where they're being attacked, and we need to know where the blind spots are. So let me start with this. If you look at the notion that we in the West genuinely and sincerely, as societies, but especially as governments, care for liberal, secular, democratic values, that is actually quite easy to attack. I could actually still do it today. Because let's start with our foreign policy, and it's quite easy to see where, depending on where our economic interests may lie, that we will, in some instances, proactively support dictatorships abroad, and in other instances, proactively undermine democratic countries, if they happen not to align with our economic interests or indeed toe the foreign policy line that we want to take. And there are clear historic examples of that, but the contemporary examples, that kind of stand out for us are especially countries like Saudi Arabia, where we've had historical alliances and relationships with absolute, total dictatorships. Now, the only region in the world where an absolute monarchy still reigns, and when I mean an absolute monarchy, I mean that the king can literally decide whether you live or die on a whim, is the Gulf, it's the Middle East. And they are, whether it's Saudi Arabia or whether it's other Gulf monarchies, they are reigning supreme. And so the line the argument or the notion that we sincerely as societies and as the state care for the advocacy of democratic values falls apart, especially when not that we're dealing with these countries on a pragmatic basis, but when we have a relationship with them where we share in their advocacy of their medieval culture. And so that may change now in 2018, but certainly from the invasion of Afghanistan onwards, we've had a very unhealthy relationship with Saudi Arabia where we have subsidized the proselytization of a certain type of Saudi foreign policy. And so the Islamist argument would be that in terms of foreign policy, of course, the interest for freedom and democracy and secularism collapses the minute economic interest comes to play. And that's, in essence, the critique of capitalism. But it's not just in foreign policy when it comes to supporting dictators, and especially in the Cold War. We saw this with the US government sponsoring coups in certain countries, sponsoring the invasion of certain countries, the Bay of Pigs and the whole Iran-Contra affair. sponsoring the assassination of certain leaders abroad because they were in the wrong political camp. They happened to be in the Soviet camp. And of course, that the US would undermine, even where people have elected them by the popular vote, the US would, in its foreign policy, actively undermine those popularly elected governments because they didn't align with the Western sphere of influence, but rather they fell in the Soviet sphere of influence. And so Islamists seize upon this when seeking to recruit Muslims to say that their advocacy for Western secular democratic values is insincere. But it becomes even more potent when you talk about it in the case of invasion of countries, right? So here you have President George Bush, who wants to, who in the name of freedom and democracy wants to spread that and decides the best way to spread freedom and democracy is by military occupation. And so, you know, it's often sometimes the obvious is staring at us in the face, but because we're not subject to the consequences of that obvious, it isn't as important a point for us. But I can guarantee you that the case for freedom and democracy in the Middle East was dealt a serious and severe and literally violent blow by the invasion of Iraq. And there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before its invasion. There certainly was no ISIS before before the invasion of Iraq by Tony Blair and George Bush. So there is also sort of that element of occupying countries that we don't like. You know, the 9/11 attacks were planned in Afghanistan. Iraq had nothing to do with it. Moving to domestic policies, of course, again, the Islamists will make a case that power is the most important thing, not values. And so when that power is threatened, the first thing to be compromised are those values. So now if I were to list, you know, cases of the civil liberties violations since the war on terror, we've pretty much lost everything. And that makes the Islamist case for us that the Western governments don't actually care for.
What do you mean that we've lost everything?
Right, so let's start with the right to liberty. So if you're going to build a human rights case up for 48 days detention without trial, which is where the UK was before David Cameron, a Conservative Prime Minister, reversed a Labour government's decision to hold a suspect for 48 days without trial. They introduced the Terrorism Act 2000, Schedule 7, which took away the right to silence under interrogation, and it became a criminal offence not to answer the police's questions if you're held at any port of entry and exit in the UK under the Terrorism Act 2000. So the right to silence, which people, what they call the Miranda rights, which people cherish, it's been removed. It's been removed, and Lawrence Southern was held
at
under
airports.
this. At any port of entry or exit in the UK, right? And of course, it all begins from that, right? So the extradition, for example, rendition.
I'm getting I'm confused about one thing, though.
Yep.
All of these.
I'm still in role play, by the way.
Yeah, no, I know, I got that. Yeah, but it seems like all of these erosions of our commitment to Western tolerance and our Enlightenment values are in the direction of values that Islamists would endorse.
Precisely.
Right? So like Islamists are not concerned about democracy and the maintenance of civil liberties.
But that's their point. They are trying to, very, very openly and frankly, candidly, trying to build societies that are hierarchical. And when we offer a response to that and say, well, we don't need that because we've got societies that are free and open and we don't want societies that are hierarchical, their argument would be you're living in an illusion.
So it's hypocrisy. The charge is hypocrisy.
More than that there is no such thing as an open society. And so if you're going to choose between hierarchical societies, if you're going to have a man that's going to tell you what to do or God tell you what to do, that's their kind of logic, right? But they're both hierarchical and opaque societies. So moving beyond Schedule 7, talk about rendition to torture, right? So the UK has directly been involved and has actually been involved in payouts to jihadist sympathizers like Mohsen Beg. They paid him money because he went to prosecute the UK government for being involved in his interrogation and torture in Bagram in Afghanistan. Whether it's him or the Libyan case that recently came out, the UK has been involved in the rendition to third countries with the cooperation of regimes that torture suspects that the UK has then profited from in terms of receiving intelligence that has been acquired through torture. And yet here we are that, you know, our critique of jihadists and Islamists is they don't respect human rights. But our governments have been, and this part is true, right? They have been involved in serious human rights violations. And so whether it's rendition to third countries or indeed detention without trial, data and spying and the Snoopers Charter, what it's called in the UK, or even the NSA spying stuff, The Islamists will generally argue that everything that we are defending doesn't actually exist. It's an illusion. And I'll finish by reading something, because in my autobiography, there's a little excerpt that I called The Polemic. And it was me attempting to remind everybody precisely what we're up against in terms of propaganda against Western Enlightenment values. And what I think we learn from this is that if we understand what those weaknesses are, it's why it's so important to defend those values where they are being eroded, because we recognize we're handing propaganda coups to those who want to destroy everything that these values stand for. But also B, we actually see where the attack's coming from, and we're better prepared to counterattack as well. So this is chapter 16 from my book. It's called The Polemic. It says, again, this is, by the way, this is me in character, right? So please don't get scared of it. You drop bombs on my people while knowing full well that the level of collateral damage, we call them innocent Muslims, will far exceed the damage to any legitimate target. For you, killing our children en masse, and you still call it collateral damage, is an unavoidable consequence of pursuing your policies in our lands. To us, they are simply children. Don't you think we've been crying too, like you are now, for years? Do you think we felt no pain as you raped and plundered our lands and bombed our cities? What lands, what cities, you ask? Your arrogance is only compounded by your ignorance. Look to Iraq. In order to remove Saddam Hussein, after the Kuwait War, you killed over 500,000 children because you could. Because you could. And because my people were too lost, too defeated to be able to stop you. These are our children. We cry for them even as you feel absolutely nothing. What of Leslie Stahl's question on 60 Minutes, posed to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright? She said, "We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died at Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?" Albright's callous response is etched in our memories, staining our innocence with her venom. She said, "I think it is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it." And you wonder why we're so angry? You wonder even now why, after all these years, as we speak these words, we are consumed with rage? The price of killing 500,000 children with your depleted uranium bombs is worth pursuing, but woe be to us if we ever strike back. In your world, Albright's interview was barely mentioned. A Dow Jones search of mainstream news sources after the attack turned up only one reference to the interview in an Orange County newspaper. But in our world, in the hell we live in, this is major news. We will not forget our dead just because you have no feelings. Is killing innocent civilians justified only for your own foreign policy interests? You claim that, unlike us, you don't target civilians, that your intentions are noble, that you seek only humane concerns. How many deaths of untargeted civilians by your hands entitles us to respond? 5? 10? 100? 500,000? Are 3,000 deaths enough to make you feel the pain of each and every mother you untargeted with depleted uranium? If not, then know that our intentions in bringing you death can also be noble. We too shroud destruction in humane concerns. You do not have a monopoly on reaping devastation off the back of good intentions. So don't you dare claim such a thing. You can support, fund, and train dictators in our lands who've been torturing our brothers and raping our sisters in their prisons for decades. And yet you invade our countries claiming to bring democracy? And you cite international law at us while you willfully ignore Israel's occupation of Palestine as defined by the United Nations itself. We will never forget your friendship with Mubarak and Assad, your unconditional support of an occupying Israel, the way you used us as mujahideen in Afghanistan only to turn on us once you got what you wanted. You chose your side and we have chosen ours. We've come to know that no amount of civilized pleading, no amount of appealing to your humanity, for your mercy, no amount of playing by your rules in your game will move you. You are stupefied in ignorant bliss while we bleed and secrete pus from every orifice. There is only one thing you people value and cherish, and that is your own lives, your own happiness, and your own selfish oblivion. If inflicting upon you even an atom's weight of the pain we suffer at your hands wakes you from your stupor and forces you to listen to our cries as we drown, then I'm afraid we have finally decided that though it's a very hard choice, the price we think is worth it.
All right, you've won me over. I'm becoming a jihadist.
Yes.
I'll send my bank account details. You can send me the check later on.
I think the wise thing for you to do now would probably be to counter that steel man.
Well, I think everyone else can do that. I've spoken too much.
Sam?
Well, I actually would add to the side of the balance against the Enlightenment in that I think there's more to the case for there's more that explains why we find ourselves in this uncanny position of having to defend Enlightenment values and reason and a scientific worldview against creeping theocracy and just naked tribalism, populism, all these eruptions of seemingly archaic and discredited ideas. And it's far simpler than just exporting our chaos to other countries and dropping bombs where we can find no other way to persuade people to just buy our products or whatever it is we intend. It's just that it's hard to live an unambiguously good life. It's hard to live a profound life. It's hard to live a life that you know each day is working. And it's pretty clear that living a good life entails more than just not being wrong about things scientifically. And it entails more than just having reasonably free markets that produce the next smartphone that you desperately want to buy. And so it's on the problem of what it means to live a good life that these kind of ancient worldviews continue to market themselves as the only game in town. I mean, so religions of all kinds, but there's something uniquely captivating about Islam in this regard because it really is the whole package in terms of its egalitarianism, it's the kind of the swiftness with which you can be indoctrinated into it, the fact that if you are kind of on the high testosterone side of things, it offers a militant and James Bondian adventure if you want to go and fight for the one true faith. And so it offers meaning in a way that's really it's just off the shelf kind of meaning that you can get. And what we're struggling for, I think, in a secular context is how you can connect people with meaning and purpose and profundity without lying to them or causing them to lie to themselves about the nature of reality or what we have every reason to believe about it. And that's a challenge that we're trying to meet, I think, in piecemeal ways, but I think we're all to some degree or another suffering the lack of a shelf in the bookstore that has no bullshit on it that does describe a philosophy of life and a way of living that is more than just seeing what's on Netflix every night.
Would that be? Are you describing the power of myth?
Yeah, I was just going to say, somewhere in North America, Jordan Peterson is just waking up, bolt upright in bed, going, "What bullshit? There's not bullshit." Sorry, he couldn't be here. It's too damn far. Douglas.
Yeah.
It's bloody far. Douglas, the loss of meaning in the West and the loss of a spine amongst Western intellectuals, the loss of a sense that there is something worthy of defending is one of the themes that you come back to a lot.
Sure. I just say at the beginning, I could go through every one of the things that Maajid just listed in that and shoot them down, but that would take a little while. Let me just make one observation about the list, which is the enormous risk that often happens of people absorbing the arguments of opponents who do not wish you well. So, for instance, on interventionism, you never hear, in fact, I've said this to Maajid before, but I've never heard anyone from the Islamic world say, "Thank God for NATO."
Yeah.
But they should.
But by the way, I'll spend the rest of my book debunking these.
Sure.
Just for everyone's,
But I mean, they shouldn't. The reason I mention this is for the selective historical reasons which we in the West are at risk of imbibing. For instance, I say, why does nobody say thank God for NATO? Because if NATO hadn't have intervened in Kosovo,
Yeah.
I think it's widely agreed that a severe genocide would have occurred on the continent of Europe, worse than was already happening. NATO intervened. We don't expect thank yous endlessly, but once will be something.
Yeah.
And
Thank you, Douglas.
so I have... It's not enough. But this is just worth remembering, because a generation and a lot of people from a generation are at risk of imbibing basically the jihadists' arguments about us.
Yeah.
And I just put that out there at the beginning. The second thing I'd just say quickly is, I mean, the fascinating thing now about looking at back, for instance, intervention in Afghanistan, is that, you know, it's one of the great fallacies of history which we're always vulnerable to, which is to think that everyone knew in the past what we know now. And, you know, until the 1980s, the major threat to countries like ours was global communism, the Soviet expansionism. We saw it as a major threat. And anyone who doubts that just has to say that, I mean, if up until, I've often thought of this, until as late as basically the 10th of September 2001, if you said, in the early years of the 21st century, politicians, journalists, public intellectuals and others are going to spend years talking about Islam. Say, what? Why? How come? It's not that interesting. It's not that vital in our societies. It's a bit of our society. It's not overwhelming. If you said, okay, you're going to be discussing Islamic blasphemy laws all across Scandinavia for years. Why?
And the jurisprudence of face veils.
Yeah, and like you're going to be the major debate in the UK in August 2018 is going to be the burqa.
Yeah.
How does that happen? I don't see I don't see the way.
That is a bit surreal, isn't it?
So here's the deep underlying thing, which is that religion's back. And most people in the West don't know how to talk about it or think about it. And I've just got this endless concern about this matter, because I've had this conversation, as I think a lot of other people here have, for years with politicians and others, and they still don't understand the nature of this. And I just give you one example quickly. A little while ago, I was speaking to a TV producer who came over to me at a party somewhere and said, it was at the height of ISIS. And she said, what do ISIS want, Douglas? And I thought, oh, okay. Well,
they're actually quite upfront about it generally.
Yeah, they're quite. They've done a lot of speaking about this and a lot of writing, and they basically want to bring about they invite the world to Islam and bring about the end times. And this woman looked at me and she said, like, she actually said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, they can't. I said, what do they really want? And I said, well, they say that they want to invite the world to Islam, or their version of Islam, and then bring about the end of times. And she just looked at me like, I don't see that. I don't. So, and then I realized, well, if I just said to her, basically what ISIS are after is like a 2.5% reduction in VAT, she'd have been all over it. Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. Well, would they settle for 1.2? You know, we'd have been able to talk about it.
It is a bit high, isn't it?
Let's find some compromise. But she had no idea. And that for me, in a nutshell, is one of the things, one of the many things we're walking through at the moment, is the inability of people in societies like ours to realize that some of our opponents believe that they have the explanation for everything, the justification for everything, the meaning of everything, now, yesterday, tomorrow, and to the ends of time and eternity. And we say, come again? At the very least, we have to educate ourselves about this.